Today I'm going to be showing you how you can build this card visual right here, which is quite literally impossible to build in Microsoft Power BI Desktop. And that's because with the click of a button in the slicer up here, it completely changes into a different card. And no, it's not using bookmarks. All of the formatting settings behind that card are quite literally changing when I click just that slicer. So how's it working? Well, we'll get to that a little later in the video because first I've got to introduce myself. Hi, my name's Ned. I work in business intelligence and I'm a Microsoft MVP with a focus on Power BI. And today we're going to be talking about Power BI project files. But before we get there, if you could do me a favor, hit the like button and then go ahead and move on over and hit the subscribe button. It would mean a lot. Okay, let's jump into the computer and let's start talking about Power BI project files. So the first thing that you need to know is what they actually are. And Power BI project files are simply a report format that you can save your Power BI report as by going File, Save As, browse this device, and then going Save as Type, Power BI project files, and then hitting Save. Now, once you've done this, up at the very top of Microsoft Power BI Desktop, it will say Power BI Project, and it will have saved the report in the Power BI project files format. I'm saying that a lot. What does that mean in reality? Well, before we get there, just a quick note. If, by the way, you're following along and you didn't have the option to save a file as a PBIP, uh, at the time of this video recording, it is a preview feature, which means you have to enable it. So go to Options and Settings, Options, then in the pop-up, go down to Preview Features, and then make sure that Power BI project save option is checked and store semantic model using Tyndall is checked and store reports using enhanced metadata format is right or is checked. So with that, jumping back then, what does saving a Power BI report as a PBIP actually do? Well, it means if you navigate to the location where you save the report, you'll see something like this. You'll see the actual PBIP file. If the report is not a thin report, you will see a semantic model folder that if you navigate into the definition section will have the actual model details in Tyndall files. And then you will see a report folder, which is what we're going to be focusing on in this video. Now, if you navigate into that report folder, you will see a couple of different files, including the PBIR file. But if you go into the definitions, what you'll see is you'll see a folder called Pages. And then if you open that Pages folder, you'll see a folder for every single page that you have in your Microsoft Power BI report. And then if you open that Pages folder, you'll see the actual page.json and then a folder called Visuals, which then if you open will have a folder for every single visual that's in your report. And you might be like, well, how do I know what page does 3455DE0697 represent? And then how do I know what visual does 254 A094B68 represent? And I'm about to tell you, so don't worry. The first thing you have to do is you have to go into Files, Options, and Settings, Options, and then under the Report Settings in the pop-up, so right down here, you have to turn on the option to copy object names when right-clicking on report objects. Once this option is enabled, you can then either right-click on a visual and go copy object name, or right-click on a page and go copy object name, and then go into a notepad editor of your choice and just hit paste, and it'll give you the object name. So here's the object name of that page I just right-clicked on. So now let's take a look at some of the files that are actually in and a part of the PBIP. So here we have this pages JSON. In this folder right here, we have this page JSON, and then in this individual visuals folder, and in that specific visuals folder, we have this visual JSON. So I've gone ahead and I've opened these up in VS Code so we can kind of get a feel for what they look like and the data that they contain. So the pages JSON first says, hey, here's what page is active. And if there were multiple pages, it would list the object IDs of those multiple pages. The page.json just contains the display name, the height, the width, kind of basic metadata around the page. But the visual JSON is where things get really interesting and really complex. First, you have kind of the initial location and order and height and width. Then you have the actual visual metadata itself. And as a part of that, you have the query, for example. And then if you had specific custom formatting settings, that would come under the query. So let's go ahead and let's edit that table that we had in that Power BI file. And let's see how this specific visual.json file actually changes. So I'm going to close out of these other two. So here we are back in Microsoft Power BI, and I'm going to click on the table visual, and then I'm going to go into the formatting pane and I'm going to turn on the title. I'm going to give this a really simple title of test. And then I'm going to go and I am going to apply some formatting, let's just say to the total row. So I'm going to up the font size and change the label to test 2. And let's I said at. Let's go test 2. And let's now save this. All right, so this is saved. And then let's go back into VS Code. Let's exit out of this visual JSON. And then let's see if we can go ahead and we can reopen this and see what's changed. So pulling it side by side to Microsoft Power BI, let's go through and let's kind of compare. So we have our positional arguments, which by the way, these tie, but I do just want to call out that these are not whole numbers. And in Power BI, you see only whole numbers. So if you have two visuals that you thought at one point weren't completely aligned, you probably were correct. We still have the query object right here that we had before. However, we now have two additional settings. So we have the objects setting itself, right? And then we have the visual container setting right here. Now, this objects setting is linked to the totals row, and we can see that because we set the font size equal to 17. It's bold, which is what I think that D is. I'm not 100% sure. And then we have the label of test 2, which you can see right here. In the visual container down here below, we now have this title, right? And this title we set to show equals true. So that's what this expression of true equals. And we also have this expression, which is set to test. Now, I want to draw your eyes and your attention to a couple of patterns that you're maybe seeing pop up in this, and that's you have the actual setting that you're changing right here, right? So in this case, uh, either a show setting or a text setting right here. And then you have this expression, literal value, and then the actual value setting. And that same thing happens up here. So we have the properties, then within the properties, we have the font size, and then we have that expression, literal value. And then here in the label, right, where we change the label, we have the expression, literal value, and then the value. So you're starting to see some kind of patterns here. Also, BT dubs, I believe the objects here is because it's a setting having to do with the actual table, where the visual container objects are technically the title's outside of the container, outside of the actual table visual itself. It's part of the container. So that's why this is part of the visual container. Just side note. But we're starting to see some patterns. So let's see if we can go ahead and we can maybe break that pattern. So what, for example, happens if we set something conditionally? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a measure over here in this Power BI file by going new measure, and then the pop-up titling this uh, fun title, and in this measure titling this title 123 and hitting save. And then I'm going to hit this FX button and I'm going to go to title and set it equal to title 123. So now we have fun title popping up in Power BI desktop. So let's go ahead and let's save this into the PBIP. Right, let's exit out of this visual and then let's go ahead and let's reopen it and see what happened. Well, when we scroll down, what you might notice is that everything stayed the same except for we now, instead of expression literal value, we now have measure expression source ref, which is the table that the entity table that the measure belonged to, and then the property, which in this case was the measure name, so title 123. So this is what happens when you're setting something conditionally to a measure value. So that is a quick overview on PIBP, but just one last thing I just forgot to mention. Settings are only being added to PIBPs as they are turned on or off. That's very important. So just keep that in mind, right? Like, you're not seeing all of these additional settings. You're only having them written to the PIBP once they have been turned on. And that doesn't mean you can't store that setting. It just means that that's what's controlling it being added to this JSON file. So now that you've learned a little bit about Power BI project files and how they work, you're probably still wondering, what do they all have to do with that fancy visual I was showing you at the start of the video? Well, if we take a look at this, what's really happening under the hood is different formatting settings are being set conditionally by me changing things in this selector table. What's unique though is that I am changing formatting settings that Power BI Desktop does not allow you to change conditionally. So how am I doing that? Well, if we go over here into this card, what you'll see is that I have a value here called zflip, and this zflip value in this measure, or I don't have a value, I have a measure here called zflip, and this measure is set to either a 0 or a 1. Now, I then have gone through and I have created a bunch of formatting settings that if zflip equals 1, it changes the different formatting settings of the card. So I'm either setting these to a true or a false, I'm adjusting padding, so on and so forth. And the way then that I am using these is I am making a reference to the measure via the PIBP. So even though I can't make, for example, a reference here to the image showing, right? If I switch between these cards and then reselect this, you'll see that the setting here is actually changing. So like if I go back and then I go back on this card, right? The image is now off. Now it is on. So how am I linking that? Well, remember that pattern that we were talking about earlier over here where we had this expression literal value true. And then when we set something conditionally, it switched to measure expression source ref entity and then the measure reference. Well, I simply created two card visuals, one that looked like how I wanted it to, and then one that looked a little bit different. And well, then went through and set all these settings to measures. So let's go in and let's go into the report, and then let's go into the definition, and then let's go into the pages, and then into that visual that I showed you. And I believe the card visual is this one right here. And let's take a look at some of these settings, right? all of them, if we look, are all being set. Well, actually, here's the query. All of them right here are all being set via measure, expression, source ref, and then the measure. And I just showed you the query again. But like I think you get the point, right? I went through and replaced almost all of those literal values with a measure reference, whether the measure was returning a valid expression. And there's some things you can't do. So, for example, this call out size, right? Like there, I can't add the D in. I need to be passing in a number. So little things like that. But what we now have is a visual that's truly, it works in PIBP. It works as code. Uh, it clearly works in Power BI, right? There's no reason from a programmatic standpoint I can't make these kinds of changes in a code if you view a report as code. It's just impossible to do this kind of thing in Microsoft Power BI desktop. So I will link this Power BI file um, saved as a PBIX. So you have to go in and save it as a PBIP on my GitHub in the video description down below if you want to download it and check it out on your own. But I think this is a really, 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 really interesting demo as to how Power BI project files enable a different and new functionality for the program. So if you've made it this far, you're now at the end of the video, and I hope you learned a lot. If you did, and you want to see more content like this, and you haven't already, please go ahead, like this video, and hit the subscribe button because it means a lot. I hope you have a great rest of your day.